and thank you for joining today. Thank you for joining today's session on the Darlington New Nuclear Project, the regulatory review and public hearing update. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Peter Bedrosian, and I work in the Regulatory Policy Directorate at the CNSC. And I'm also joined by many of my esteemed CNSC colleagues on this webinar. I would like to begin by recognizing that our participants today are located in many different parts of the country. Today, I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Darlington is located in the municipality of Clarington, which is within the traditional territory of the Wendat Anishinaabe Nation and the territory covered by the Williams Treaties with the Mississauga and the Chippewa Nations. So I'll pause for a few seconds in silence so that each of us can acknowledge the treaty and/or traditional territory of our respective locations. Please take this time to provide your gratitude and acknowledgement for the land. So thank you for your acknowledgement. So before we officially start with the webinar, the actual presentation, I would like to take a few moments of your time to ask a polling question, or several polling questions, that is. So we appreciate everyone's participation, and as this will help us gather information and feedback on this webinar and contribute to our continuous improvement with respect to our engagement and outreach activities. And so for those who may not be familiar with this function in Zoom, your individual answers will not be displayed, only the overall results will be shown. So the first polling question we have here, there are two polling questions. The first one is, have you previously attended a CNSC webinar about the Darlington New Nuclear Project? I'll give you a chance to answer that question. And then the second one is, how would you rate your current understanding of the Darlington New Nuclear Project? Whether it's excellent, good, or fair, or poor, that is. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. I'm hoping you guys are able to answer. I can't see how many are answering at the moment. Usually there's a metric that provides that at least an indicator that provides how many people have answered. So I'm hoping that everyone has an opportunity to submit their response. Okay, I've been told there's about 84% participation rate, which is reasonable. Give you a few more seconds if there are any more that would like to submit their responses. Okay, I think we'll end the polling questions here. I'm hoping that, all right, there you go. So I've realized that I see the results now of the polling question, that there's about 28% of you have said that you previously attended a webinar on the DNNP, the Darlington Nuclear Project, and the remainder, 70%, haven't. And I've also see, in terms of the level of understanding, your current understanding of the DNNP varies. So about half, a little more than half, 15 to 38% is either good or excellent. And then the remainder is either fair and poor. So I'm hoping this presentation, irrespective of your background or your knowledge on the subject matter, does provide you some enhanced knowledge moving forward. Okay, so now that we're done with the polling questions, we'd like to thank you for your participation, that is, and I do want to highlight there will be more polling questions following the presentation. So now on to the rules of engagement before we proceed with the actual session. So if you have any questions during the webinar, we ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So we encourage you to submit your questions anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Now, the chat and raise hand function in Zoom will not be in use during the webinar, so please send your questions using the Q&A feature. Now, as a reminder, the question should only be focused on the content of today's webinar, and only those within scope will be addressed. And I do want to highlight that this Meet the Nuclear Regulator session is not an extension of any future commission proceedings. It is meant to provide an update on the regulatory review and hearing process for OPG's Darlington New Nuclear Project. We'd also kindly ask that your questions be presented in a respectful and professional manner. Now, time permitting, we will address all of your questions. Any questions not answered today will be addressed and sent by email to all participants. We do want to note that all questions submitted through the Q&A function will be visible to the panelists and will be read out during the Q&A session in an anonymous manner. Now, if you do not submit your question anonymously, your name will be displayed next to your questions to all participants as they are marked answered. Now, any questions outside of scope of this webinar will not be addressed, as we do encourage you to submit them through the info account email address found on the CNSC website. And we'd also like to advise that this session is being recorded, and so the recording may be available at a later time. Okay, without further ado, let's get started with the presentation. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to give you an update on the regulatory review and the hearing process for OPG's Darlington New Nuclear Project. Now, here's an outline of the presentation, and we'll be covering the following topics. First, the overview of CNSC, including our mandate and tribunal, DNNP overview and licensing review approach. We'll give some details on the commission member document, which is specifically the first one relating to this project. We'll also give you an update on public hearing number 1 and present some key dates. We'll give an overview and update on the LTC application. And lastly, we will share details of our outreach and engagement efforts and go over upcoming events. Next slide, please. So first off, I'll give you an overview of the CNSC, who we are, what our mandate is, who our tribunal is, and also our responsibilities as a regulator, and then licensee responsibilities. And of course, in this case, the licensee is OPG. Ready to move to the next slide, please. Now, the CNSC is the sole authority in Canada for regulating the development, production, and the use of nuclear energy, the production and possession and the use of nuclear substances, prescribed equipment, and prescribed information as required under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. Now, there are 3 pillars that comprise the CNSC's mandate. The first is to regulate the use of nuclear energy and materials to protect the health, safety, security, and environment for Canadians. The second is to implement Canada's international commitments on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And thirdly, and somewhat unique amongst Canadian regulators, government agencies, and departments, is a mandate to disseminate objective, scientific, technical, and regulatory information to the public and Indigenous nations and communities. Now, as such, the CNSC considers outreach such that we're doing today to be at the core of its daily work. Now, CNSC does not promote nuclear activities, but it is the CNSC's job to safely regulate such activity. Next slide, please. Now, decisions to grant a license are made by an independent commission made up of a panel of experts. This commission is arm's length from government. Well, the commission is made up of, has up to 7 members at any given time, and they are appointed by Governor and Council based on their qualifications and expertise. Now, you can see the current members of the commission on this screen, currently displayed on this screen. Now, the commission makes its decision transparently, guided by clear rules and procedures. Interested parties and members of the public are able to participate in public commission hearings, which are webcast live, and often held in facility host communities to make them as accessible as possible to local residents. The commission provides extensive reasons for its decisions, which are based on information and evidence that includes public input, as well as the recommendations of expert CNSC staff. Decisions, hearing transcripts, webcast archives, and other documentation are publicly available on the CNSC website. Now, the commission is supported by more than 800 scientific, technical, and professional staff, that being us, of course. Now, these employees review applications for licenses according to regulatory requirements and make recommendations to the commission. We're ready to move on to the next slide, please. Now, as a regulator, The CNSC is responsible for establishing a licensing and compliance system to ensure that all persons who use or possess nuclear substances and radiation devices do so in accordance with a license, and that regulated parties have safety and security provisions in place to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements. Now, this ensures that licensees are directly responsible, that is, for managing regulated activities in a manner that protects health, safety, security, and the environment, and that conforms with Canada's domestic and international obligations on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Now, through this licensing and compliance system, the CNSC ensures that regulated parties are informed about regulatory requirements and provides guidance on how to meet requirements while verifying they are and to continue to be met. Now, doing all of this, the CNSC makes independent and objective and risk-informed decisions. Now, it's important to mention that this regulatory philosophy aligns with the International Atomic Energy Agency safety fundamentals. We're ready for the next slide. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague Bartek to continue with the presentation.
All right, thank you, Peter. So my name is Bartek Rezenkowski, and I work for the Advanced Reactors Licensing Division at the CNSC. So now we'll provide an overview of the Darlington New Nuclear Project, including information on the project background and also the license application that OPG submitted to the CNSC. Next slide, please. So the OPG Darlington New Nuclear Project is for the construction and operation of up to 4 new nuclear reactors at the existing Darlington site in the municipality of Clarington. The environmental assessment for this project began back in 2006 when OPG applied for a license to prepare a site to build up to 4 new nuclear reactors at the Darlington site. And an environmental assessment commenced under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 1992 and was completed in 2012. In December 2021, OPG selected the GE Hitachi BWX-300 reactor technology. The selection of the reactor technology required OPG to demonstrate that its chosen technology fits within the bounds of the environmental assessment that was previously completed. Last year, in October of 2022, OPG submitted a license to construct application to construct 1 small modular reactor of up to 300 megawatt electric. Next slide, please. So to explain where we are in a large view of things, this slide here is an overview of the CNC licensing process and what happens after we receive an application. So the CNC licensing process begins when an application is submitted. So in this case, OPG submitted an application for a license to construct. CNC staff are in the technical assessment stage where the application is being reviewed in the context of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act and the relevant regulations that apply to the activities in the application. We'll go into more detail on what happens in the technical assessment stage a little bit later in the following slide. So, oh no, sorry, go back to the previous slide. So following the technical assessment, CNC staff provides a commission member document with the results of its review and recommendations to the commission. For this project, 2 commission member documents are being developed because 2 separate decisions are being sought, as 2 different hearings will be held for these 2 separate decisions. We'll go into more detail about these 2 separate decisions a little bit later. The commission will review the 2 commission member documents and makes decisions on the licensing through a public hearing process. The public hearing gives Indigenous nations and communities, interested stakeholders, and members of the public an opportunity to be heard before the commission. As mentioned, there will be 2 hearings for this project. So the first one will take place in January of 2024. The second hearing is tentatively scheduled for October of 2024, but it is tentative because it depends on the outcome of the first hearing. Following a public hearing, the commission will deliberate and make its decision on the matter. During this licensing process, there is an ongoing engagement of the public in Indigenous nations and communities. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows more detail on our technical assessment process, which OPG submissions have gone through. The assessment of a license application is a multi-step process, as shown in the pictorial here on the slide. Information submitted by OPG is assessed against the regulations, the Joint Review Panel recommendations, our regulatory documents, international guidance, codes and standards, and professional judgment. So as part of this review, CNSC will also request expertise from relevant federal departments. So for example, those responsible for species at risk or fish and fish habitat, noise, and transportation of dangerous goods. So CNSC may also request expertise from province and third parties, such as academics or international experts. Examples of topics covered in the technical assessment include safety analysis, radiation protection programs, detailed decommissioning planning, and operator training programs. If CNC staff conclude that an application is not complete or not satisfactory, then the proponent will be asked to submit additional information and/or revise their documentation. The technical review process continues until CNC staff are satisfied that all requirements are met. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, two separate commission member documents will be developed as two separate decisions need to be made. So a commission member document is a report which documents the conclusions and recommendations of the CNC staff review. So this slide here summarizes the two commission member documents required for this project, often referred to as CMDs. So the first CMD is for the CNC staff review of the documentation that OPG submitted to demonstrate how the selected technology, the BWX 300 that is, how it fits within the bounds of the environmental assessment that was completed in 2012. This CMD is now available online, and the hearing is scheduled for the week of January 22nd of 2024. The second CMD is for the CNC staff review of OPG's license to construct application and its supporting documentation, which was submitted back in October of 2022, exactly a year from today, actually. So this CMD is targeted to be available on June 18th of 2024, with a tentative date set for the hearing in October of 2024. So these CMDs are provided to the Commission, which is the decision-making body for licensing of nuclear facilities. With that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Nicole Simon.
Thanks, Bartek. My name is Nicole Simon. I am a senior project officer also in the Advanced Reactors Licensing Division, and I work with Bartek on this project. So far, we've given an overview of the project, the license application itself, and the licensing process that's applied for the DNMP. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on CMD number 1, including an overview and a summary of the results of CNSC staff's review of the documentation submitted by OPG. Next slide, please. Okay. These screens here. So as mentioned before, the first CMD is for CNSC staff's review of the documentation that OPG submitted to demonstrate how the BWRX fits within the bounds of the environmental assessment. In 2022, OPG submitted two documents for this, the updated plant parameter envelope, or PPE, going forward, as well as their updated environmental impact statement review report, or EIS review report, going forward. For this CMD, CNC staff completed a review of those two documents submitted by OPG, and we will go into a bit more detail on the outcomes of staff's review of each of these documents in the following sets of slides. CNC staff analysis and conclusions of our review of these documents are recorded in the CMD, CMD number 1. Of course, it is now available online for anyone to review it and provide comments or interventions. Hearing for the CMD is scheduled for the week of January 22nd, 2024. Of course, we note that everyone is welcome to watch the hearing online. It will be webcast. And you may also formally participate as interveners. Information on how to get involved can be found on the CNSC staff's websites. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first document reviewed by CNSC staff was the parameter envelope report. Purpose of this approach was to allow for the assessment of potential adverse environmental effects associated with the project without specifying a reactor technology. The PPE approach applied for the DNMP included 198 distinct parameters applicable to the project. And in its review, OPG reviewed the PPE against the selected technology, the BWRX reactors, and found certain parameters that were not bounded within the envelope and thus required further assessment. Summary of OPG's assessment of each of these parameters that are outside of the bounds is shown in the table on this slide. CNSC staff concluded overall that these parameters that are outside of the bounds of the PPE have been adequately assessed by OPG, and that the mitigation measures identified in the EA remain adequate to ensure that there are no residual adverse environmental effects from BWRX deployment. So very briefly, 8 parameters that were identified as outside of the bounds were for fire protection systems. There was a higher short-term water withdrawal rate and a larger amount of water that was needed to be stored in the fire protection system for the BWRX versus that was assessed in the EA. And for the demineralized or potable water system, parameter that was identified as outside of the bounds was that the maximum flow rate was lower from the municipal supply, and there will be less wastewater discharge into the municipal system. For foundation depth, there was found to be a temporary impact. The parameter that was outside of the scope was the depth of the foundation was 38 meters below grade versus 20 meters below grade as identified in the environmental assessment. It was also found to be a temporary impact on groundwater flow during construction dewatering, with this effect ceasing after construction. It's found to be a lesser impact than a permanent change to groundwater flow, predicted in EA. Airborne emissions were a fraction of the total of the emissions that were estimated in the EA. Carbon-14 and radioiodines specifically were slightly elevated compared to the values that were identified in the EA. However, tritium particulates and noble gas quantities were estimated to be lower. Radioactive waste, volume of radioactive waste was lower, however, but the radioactivity per unit volume was higher than predicted in the EA. CNSC staff note that handling equipment for waste containers will be designed for a higher radioactivity, and heavier casks will be used to accommodate for this as well. And finally, the 8th parameter that was outside of the bounds was the wind impact assessment. Excuse me. An updated methodology was available to reassess whether the design of certain DNMP buildings is adequate for high wind speed gusts. This reassessment was consistent with the EA conclusions on building design, consistent with the EA conclusions on the building design. Next slide, please. Second document that was reviewed by staff was OPG's updated EIS review report for the deployment of up to 4 reactors. We will note that, the original EA defined the scope of the DNMP, described the existing environment at the time, and analyzed potential environmental effects. This analysis grouped aspects of the environment into environmental components. OPG's EIS review assessed for each of these environmental components how the on-site conditions, the conditions on-site and near the DNMP have changed since 2012, and whether the deployment of up to 4 reactors remains within the bounds of the EA. A summary of the OPG's EIS review is presented in the table on this slide and on the next slide as well. CNSC staff's more detailed assessment of OPG's EIS review can be found in greater detail within our CMD. Again, very briefly, just a quick overview in terms of each environmental component. in terms of air quality or atmospheric environmental component, we found OPG's EIS review found that the smaller footprint of the BWRX facility requires less excavation and less heavy equipment use, therefore lowering overall emissions and noise. For aquatic habitat and biota, in general, aquatic habitat is less impacted as compared to the predictions of the EA. As lake infilling, removal of on-site ponds is no longer required. Shoreline stabilization will be required still as well, and the effects of that are consistent with those predicted in the EA. And I note that for surface water, the BWRX has a lower, sorry, that term is not defined, a lower condenser cooling water intake flow rate as compared to the EA, reducing the overall effects on lake circulation and overall lake temperature. No radioactive substances are released to the lake through this system, and then the predicted effects on both on lake water temperature are consistent with the EA as well. For soil and groundwater, the effects from deployment of BWRX 300 reactors on groundwater flow is expected to be consistent with the EA. That said, flow is expected to be temporarily affected due to mitigation measures implemented during construction dewatering, though it is expected that the groundwater flow will return to previous levels following the cessation of dewatering as well. There are no predicted, there are no predicted long-term effects on soil or groundwater quality, provided that the mitigation measures identified in the EA are implemented. And for terrestrial habitat and terrestrial biota, there is potential for some terrestrial habitat to remain that was predicted to be removed in the environmental assessment. For example, woodland habitat for endangered bats and amphibian breeding areas. Several species were newly identified as of conservation concerns since the completion of the EA. And of course, as we will note that activities with any potential adverse effects on these species would require authorizations by the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Climate and Parks, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada, respectively. CNSC staff found that potential effects on landscape connectivity, are consistent with the EA and are adequately addressed through mitigation measures to maintain access for wildlife. Next slide, please. For radioactivity and human health for physical well-being, OPG's EIS review identified a predicted radiological dose from 4 reactors under normal operations of 1.2 microsieverts per year. The public, which is a small fraction of the regulatory public dose limit of 1 millisievert per year. Similarly, radiological doses to nuclear energy workers were predicted to be well below respective dose limits, and non-radiological releases are also below predictions from the EA. Therefore, human health risks from the BWRX emissions are predicted to be minimal. And finally, for biota health or health of non-human biota, radiological dose assessment for normal operations predicted that the doses to terrestrial receptors is well below predictions from the EA. Staff's overall conclusion was that changes to environmental components since the completion of the EA have been adequately assessed by OPG. Those changes do not alter the conclusions of the EA, which found no residual adverse environmental effects, provided the mitigation measures, the recommendations from the JRP, as well as requirements from the EA follow-up program are implemented. Next slide, please. So CNSC staff's overall conclusion, as documented within the CMD, is that OPG's selection of the BWRX reactor is bound within the EA, and that staff expect no significant residual adverse environmental effects from the deployment of up to 4 reactors, provided that the mitigation measures identified in the EA are implemented, JRP recommendations are complete, and the EA follow-up program actions are implemented as well. Based on those conclusions, CNSC staff recommended that the Commission accept staff's recommendation that the Darlington New Nuclear Project EA is applicable to the deployment of the reactor at the DNP site. Next slide, please. Okay, so after the CMD has been submitted, the Commission now is reviewing the CMD and will make its decision through the public hearing process. As mentioned before, public hearing number 1 is scheduled for January 2024 and will focuses the scope of the scope of the hearing is focused on the documentation that we just discussed. So in the next couple of slides, I'll briefly discuss the scope of the hearing and the ultimate decision that needs to be made regarding OPG's license application. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So the hearing is scheduled for the week of January 22nd, 2024, and it will take place in the Darlington community. As mentioned, the purpose of the first public hearing is for the Commission to consider and decide on the applicability of the EA with respect to OPG's selected BWX 300 small modular reactor, as per the Government of Canada's response to the JRP recommendation in the approved EA. I will note that this hearing will not include a licensing decision under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. A decision on whether to issue a construction license for the DNP will be completed at a potential future second hearing for this project, tentatively scheduled for October 2024. OPG's hearing submission and CNSC staff CMD number 1 are currently available on the CNSC registry website, and after a hearing has been held, decision will be made approximately 12 weeks after. Next slide, please. Okay, and for this project, we are offering a multi-stage participant funding program, or PFP. This program exists to provide financial assistance to get people involved in the regulatory activities and in the overall hearing process for this project. We offered a first stage of participant funding for reviewing both reports OPG had submitted to the CNSC. That stage is now complete. The second stage of funding, which is currently in progress, is for the participation in hearing number 1 for this project. We received applications until May 26th for this stage, and we awarded financial support in June of this year. And those support may be used for helping to submit interventions for the first hearing, and we note those interventions are due on the 20th of November of this year. Finally, the third stage of funding is for participation in hearing number 2, and my colleague will discuss this third stage in the next couple of slides. At this point, I will hand it back to Bartek.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. So we've discussed now OPG's submission of documentation to demonstrate how the selected technology, so the BWX 300, fits within the bounds of the 2012 environmental assessment. So we've gone over CNC staff's review of the documents and the conclusions and recommendations. So now we'll discuss OPG's LTC license to construct application and its supporting documentation. So we'll go over some important dates and details for the second CMD and hearing. Next slide, please. So for the second CMD, CNC staff will complete a review of OPG's LTC application and its supporting documentation. So CNC staff's analysis and conclusions of their review will be recorded in what is referred to as CMD number 2. OPG's application is currently under technical review, and the CMD for this review is targeted to be available in June of 2024. If you'd like to submit an intervention for this hearing, meaning hearing number 2, then these are due to the CNC registry by August 20th of 2024. And the public hearing is tentatively scheduled for October 2024. This hearing is tentatively scheduled as it depends on the Commission decision from hearing number 1. The second public hearing will occur if and only if the Commission has determined that the BWX 300 reactor fits within the bounds of the 2012 environmental assessment. Next slide, please. Now for the scope and purpose for the second hearing. So we'll note here that whether hearing number 2 takes place is dependent on the decision rendered by the Commission following the first hearing. So the purpose of the second hearing is to consider and decide on the capability of the licensee, so OPG in this case, to construct a single BWX 300 reactor at the existing Darlington site. CNC staff are currently conducting a review of OPG's license to construct application and its supporting documentation, and the results of the CNC staff review will be posted after the targeted date of June 18th of 2024. And then the second hearing is scheduled after that tentatively for October 2024. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, we are offering a multi-staged participant funding program to provide financial assistance to get everyone involved in our regulatory activities and in the hearing process for this project. So we discussed the first 2 stages previously as they relate to OPG's plant parameter envelope and environmental impact statement submission and hearing number 1. So this third stage of the participant funding program is for the involvement in the process for hearing number 2. This was launched October 10th, and the applications will be received until December 8th. Details on how to submit an application can be found on our website or by clicking the link on the slide here. We do want to note that this presentation will be sent to all participants in the coming days. The financial support may be used for helping to submit interventions for the second hearing. So those interventions are due August 20th of 2024. Next slide, please. With that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Emily Jensen.
Okay, thanks, Bartek. So my name is Emily Jansen, and I'm on the same team as Bartek and Nicole, and I'll be going over our holistic calendar of all the events related for this project. So far we've given you the history of the project and also an update on the status of the regulatory review. And now this is a look forward on the events that you can expect to see in the coming couple of years. So go to the next slide, please. So we've thrown a lot of information at you and a lot of dates and things, and this is a visual to kind of bring everything together so you can see what is going to happen over the next year or so. So it's also included all the dates that have been mentioned in the previous slides. So as we'd mentioned, CNSC launched its 3rd round of PFP earlier this month, participant funding program. We have this webinar today presenting an update on the licensing review for this project. And interventions are due November 20th for hearing number 1. If you'd like to submit one, that's the due date. And hearing number 1 is scheduled for January 2024. We are planning to hold another webinar or a workshop in May or June of next year to give another update and to also go over hearing number 2 if it does go forward. And then June 18th of next year, the CMD for hearing number 2 will be available. That's when it's scheduled for tentatively right now, June 18th, which will document CNSC staff's analysis and conclusions of the review of OPG's license to construct application and supporting documentation. Interventions for hearing number 2 would be due in August of next year. And then we're planning to hold another webinar in September 2024 ahead of hearing number 2 if it does go forward to provide an update on the project and also the hearing that will take place. And then, as we mentioned before, hearing number 2 is tentatively scheduled for October 2024. And just a reminder to everyone that this presentation will be sent out to all of the attendees after, so don't worry about writing all this stuff down. You'll have the presentation to refer back to with all of this information. And next slide, please. So that concludes the presentation today. Thank you so much for tuning in.